and welcome to MedCity's Pivot Podcast. I am Arundhati Parmar, your host and editor-in-chief of MedCity News. With April, we are launching into our second season of the Pivot Podcast, where we focus on innovations in oncology treatment. Today, I'm interviewing Ben Zeskind, co-founder, president, and CEO of Immuneering. Immuneering is a clinical stage biotechnology company based in Boston. Now, cancer traditionally has been treated by chemotherapy, and that has a whole host of side effects. What Immuneering is trying to do is developing drugs that it hopes can help patients manage cancers like pancreatic and other types of cancers, almost like a chronic disease, and without some of those really harsh side effects. Hello, Ben. Welcome to the MedCity Pivot Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, your company is trying to engineer the immune system in such a way that even people battling aggressive cancers like pancreatic cancers can survive over the long term. Can you explain how your approach toward cancer is different from how it is traditionally viewed and treated?
Sure. Well, that's right. Our goal is to help cancer patients live longer and feel better, right? And I think too often that second goal is sort of left by the wayside. But we believe it's possible to do both. And really the way we're going about that is taking targets that are already validated, and pursuing them in a new way, that we believe will deliver better efficacy and better tolerability. And our drug that's furthest along is in phase 2A already for pancreatic cancer.
So, can you drill down a little bit in terms of what you think is wrong with the way regular chemotherapy regimens are happening and how you plan to do it in your with your lead candidate?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's kind of been this sort of no pain, no gain philosophy in the development of cancer drugs, and you see it in a lot of different forms. First, a lot of drugs, the way they're developed and the doses identified is they're dosed up to what's called a maximum tolerated dose.
Mhm.
So literally, they go, when they're developing the drug, they go higher and higher and higher until it makes a patient really sick, and then they back off one, right? And that's sort of the dose. And I think that thinking is outdated. That's kind of thinking from the chemotherapy era. So we've not followed that approach. We've aimed to identify kind of the biologically optimal dose, which is it's really more about how much you inhibit the pathway
Mhm.
than sort of going to the highest dose. And part of the way we've been able to do that is by designing our drug differently. So there's the dose that you select and sort of whether or not you go up to the maximum tolerated dose. There's also the kind of the dynamics, the timing of how your drug works. So for the pathway that we work on, and actually in most targeted oncology therapies, the goal has always been to shut down the pathway 24/7,
Mhm.
to make drugs with long half-lives that chronically inhibit the pathway. And we actually, based on insights from our informatics platform, we realized there might be a different way, which we call deep cyclic inhibition, where basically you can, instead of kind of shutting down the pathway all the time, you can actually hit it harder for a short period of time and then release. And what that does is basically we believe it hits the cancer cells harder than the healthy cells. And I can explain why that is, but that's kind of the approach we've taken.
Okay, so first let's talk about the pathway. Can you describe the pathway? And then you can also talk about the idea that when we do chemotherapy, I'm a little bit familiar with it. I had an older brother who was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney cancer and he passed away. So we started with targeted therapy, then went to chemotherapy. The idea with chemotherapy is like it kills everything that it sees, right? And so I think that that's what you're trying to get away from. So but the lead candidate that you're using also has some chemotherapy in it. I mean, you're doing it in combination with the therapy, if I read it correctly. So first of all, let's start with what the pathway is and then how you're using chemotherapy in the trial that you're now pursuing.
Sure. And first of all, sorry to hear about your brother. Condolences on that. So the pathway that we're going after is called the MAP kinase pathway, which is also known as the RAS RAF MEK ERK pathway. And this is a pathway that drives about half of all human tumors. So it's very widely used in or utilized by cancers. And in fact, the part of the pathway that we're targeting is called MEK. So the pathway goes RAS, RAF, MEK, ERK. So we're a little bit further downstream. And there've been other drugs that target MEK before, and they've actually been shown already to help patients live longer. So there was a study called the COMBI-D study where they looked specifically at patients with BRAF mutant melanoma, and what they saw was when they, first they would treat them with a RAF inhibitor alone, and that helped. But when they compared that to adding in a MEK inhibitor in combination with the RAF inhibitor, the patients lived about 6 months longer
Mhm.
on average, longer overall survival. So MEK inhibitors have already been shown to help patients live longer. But the challenge is they've been really limited to a small subset of patients, uh, mainly with those mutations in BRAF or patients with neurofibromas. And they've been very poorly tolerated, to the point that it really limits their use. It limits their ability to combine with other drugs. So when we started making our drug and we developed it in-house, it's novel composition of matter. We didn't license it from somewhere. We built it ourselves, and we said we want to solve those two challenges. We want to make kind of a next generation MEK inhibitor that works more broadly in patients with RAS mutations, not just RAF mutation,
Mhm.
and we want to make it much better tolerated. And so those were really kind of our two design goals in making our drug, which is called IMM 1104. And so that's the pathway, that's the approach we took. And what we decided to do was to, analyze do an informatics analysis, use data and computers to look at the gene expression patterns that these kind of first generation MEK inhibitors were making. And what we found was actually really counterintuitive. We found that so gene expression or transcriptomics is sort of when you give a drug, cells react to it, and certain genes are turned on, others are turned off. And when we looked at that, we found that early on in the course of treatment, at 3 hours, at 6 hours, the MEK inhibitors were doing the right thing, right? They were upregulating genes that were otherwise down with disease, and vice versa. But by 24 hours, it was actually the opposite. By 24 hours, they were actually making things worse. And so that was really the kind of the aha that came from our computational platform, where we said, maybe this conventional wisdom of shutting down the pathway 24/7 isn't the best way to go. Maybe if we do something more intermittent, with this cyclical inhibition, maybe we could actually, hit the tumor harder and be better tolerated. So that was really kind of the origin of this deep cyclic inhibition approach. And as we took it into animals and ultimately to humans, we've seen really encouraging efficacy and tolerability.
So we'll talk about results in just a second, but can you give me an
Yeah.
idea of who the right patient is? Because in cancers, you have to select the right patient to be able to get a good result for them. So is this a first line medication that you're developing, and who is the right patient for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a broad set of patients, and it really has to do with the mutations that are driving their tumor.
Hmm.
So uh, any patient who has a tumor that's driven by the MAP kinase pathway could potentially benefit from this treatment, we believe. Now, the areas where we're testing it are really focused in a few main areas. The first is pancreatic cancer, and because the vast majority of pancreatic cancers are driven by this pathway, we actually don't have to test anything. We can take all comers in pancreatic cancer. Up to 97% of pancreatic cancer tumors are believed to be driven by this MAP kinase pathway. So in
Okay.
pancreatic cancer, we can cast a very wide net.
Hmm.
We're also looking at melanoma and lung cancer in our phase 2A, and there, the patients have to have a mutation in RAS, which is one of the genes in this pathway.
Hmm.
So it's really about the mutations the patient has that are driving the pathway.
Okay, makes sense. And then let's talk a little bit about the results. You have some preliminary results, so can you please explain how it's working and whether you're happy with it?
Oh yeah, we're thrilled. So what we're seeing. Let's start with pancreatic cancer, and we've evaluated it in the phase 2A, really in two different settings. In the second line setting as monotherapy, and in the first line setting as a combination. And so this
Okay.
gets a little bit back to part of your prior question as well.
Hmm.
So in the second line monotherapy setting, we're seeing response rates and disease control rates, that are very, very competitive. So what we announced a 5% overall response rate, 52% disease control rate. This is in the second line setting as a monotherapy.
Okay.
And just for context, the benchmarks in that setting are kind of in the 3 to 17% range for overall response rate, and in the 24 to 54% range for again for the disease control rate.
Okay.
So essentially, what that means, and keep in mind those benchmarks are all chemotherapies given in combination as infusions with all the tolerability challenges, the toxicity that normally comes with chemotherapy.
Right.
Whereas we're able to come in um, with an oral once daily medication, that's much better tolerated. So in fact, if you look at our table of treatment related adverse events that occur in at least 10% of patients, there's no grade 3 or grade 4 adverse events in that table,
Wow.
which is highly unusual. Yeah,
And then
so
you
it
don't have to sit at an infusion center.
exactly. So that's um, and we hear things from our investigators like it's having a transformative impact, because again, to have these very competitive response rates and disease control rates, but with an oral well tolerated therapy, that's certainly really really impactful. And but the best thing about the tolerability is actually that it enables combinations. And
Right.
so that's really the other arm that we've been evaluating, which is in the first line setting,
Hmm.
combination with standard of care chemotherapy.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
and so that's I can tell you about those results as well.
Yes, please. Go
Okay,
ahead.
so there we're combining with gemcitabine nab-paclitaxel, which is one of the standard of care chemotherapies for pancreatic cancer, and what we're seeing is extremely encouraging in terms of both overall response rate and disease control rate. So in that setting, we're seeing our most recently announced data in January was a 43% overall response rate, and an 86% disease control rate. So
Hmm.
again, for context, the benchmarks in that setting are kind of 23 to 42% for the ORR, and then 48% to 70% for the disease control rate.
Hmm.
Um, so just really, really encouraging. We're also, if you look at our waterfall plot, which is basically a plot of how by patient, how the lesions are shrinking. It's kind of, it's sort of the right half. The vast majority of patients, the lesions are shrinking in the data we announced in January. And we even had a patient with a complete response, which means the cancer basically goes away completely for a period of time. So, really exciting data that we shared in January. And again, the tolerability there, it was just very differentiated relative to what you typically see for the standard of care in that setting. And that's really, um, it's really because of the unique characteristics of 104, and also because we're able to use a lighter version of the chemotherapy when we
Hmm.
combine. So the typical standard of care gemcitabine nab-paclitaxel is given 3 weeks on, 1 week off. We're able to give a modified version that's every other week. So
Okay.
we can actually go lighter on the chemotherapy because we're combining with 104.
And is that an infused drug or is that an oral?
The chemo is infused.
Infused.
So
Okay.
in the combination, the patients still have to go to the infusion center to get the chemo, but less often, right?
Okay.
We're
Yeah.
doing the
Yeah.
modified version. Um, and that modified version has lower toxicity than the kind of the full version of the chemo. So just
Mhm.
just to kind of give you one example of that, a common adverse event for these standard of care chemotherapies in pancreatic cancer is neutropenia.
Mhm.
And if you look at uh, the standard of care FOLFIRINOX has about a 46% rate of grade 3 plus neutropenia. So nearly half the patients are having this serious neutropenia. If you look at the normal regimen, kind of the standard regimen of gemcitabine and nab-paclitaxel, the 3 weeks on, 1 week off, it's 38% kind of grade 3 or more neutropenia.
Mhm.
Um, with our study, the data we announced in January with 104 combined with this modified regimen, it's only 10%.
And then
Um,
explain what neutropenia is.
it's a reduction in a certain type of blood cells.
Okay. Okay.
So so that's kind of a side effect that can be problematic.
So
Um,
makes you weak essentially.
I guess that's sort of one way to think about it. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, and there's a whole host of other side. I'm just kind of giving that one as an example.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, and of course you always have to take all cross trial comparisons with a grain of salt. But yeah, I think it's helpful to sort of look at the benchmarks.
Okay. Makes sense. And then, so these are being developed parallelly. These two clinical trials are happening in the same phase, or one is ahead and one's a little bit behind.
Yeah, no, they're all these are just different arms of the same phase 2A.
Okay. Got it. Got
So
it.
we have a first line combination arm. We actually have two first line combination arms, and then we have the second line monotherapy arm as well, all in pancreatic cancer.
And what are the chances of this drug actually being commercialized?
Uh, I mean, we think the data is very encouraging. I can't put a number on it, obviously, subject to future data, but I mean, here's one way to think about it. I mentioned we had a complete response in pancreatic cancer, where the tumors all went away for a period of time. Um, in the phase 3 study of the chemo alone, that happened once in 431 patients,
Okay.
and we saw it in the first 7 that we reported in January. So that's exceedingly rare. The disease control rate I
Hmm.
mentioned of 86% that we reported in January, which is just very, very competitive relative to the benchmarks. And, in a lot of cancers, disease control rate ultimately sort of tracks better to survival, both progression-free survival and overall survival, which is ultimately how drugs are approved, right? They're not
Right.
approved based on the response rate; they're approved
Right.
based on survival. So we're certainly very uh, excited and optimistic based on the data that we've released so far.
You said that you had a complete response where the cancer went away for a period of time. That begs the question, did it come back later?
Yeah, so in it's a little bit unfortunate in that particular case. The patient had to be hospitalized for an unrelated reason, and when you're hospitalized, you have to stop taking the drug. And so when you stop taking the drug, sometimes the tumors do come back.
Come back. Got
So
it.
that
Okay.
you know
Makes
that's
sense.
just a kind of a sort of specific situation. But what we've seen in general is really interesting durability. So we actually we've reported on a patient from way back in our phase 1 study,
Hmm.
who was on 104 monotherapy in the third line setting, meaning this patient had failed, uh, uh, had progression on first line treatment, had progression on a second line treatment, and then came to us. And in that setting, we sort of recently updated that, the patient has been on treatment for over 13 months,
Hmm.
with, we reported a 28% reduction in their lesions.
Hmm.
So that's just, and I think that kind of shows what you can do when you have this kind of efficacy and tolerability, right? I mean, that patient, gained weight, which never happens in pancreatic cancer. Yeah, there's blood-based biomarkers of tumor burden in pancreatic cancer that have gone down by over an order of magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
And really, the best part is we hear from the investigators that that patient's been essentially living a normal life for the last year with,
Wow.
with third line pancreatic cancer. And it really, for us, it kind of gives us a glimpse
Mm-hmm.
into this future where maybe, and again, the tumors shrank by 28%. They're not gone, right?
Yeah.
They shrank 28%. So maybe, y- you know, maybe in the end, cancer is more like HIV, right? There's no cures for HIV. It doesn't go away completely, but there's medicines now
Mm-hmm.
that enable patients to live with it as a chronic disease for
Right.
many years and essentially live normal lives. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do the same thing for cancer?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this case study in the first line setting really sort of gives a glimpse into that potential future. And for us, it's really about designing and making drugs, certainly our 104, but the rest of our pipeline as well, that are well tolerated and effective, so patients can stay on for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
They can be combined when they need to be combined, and we really think that's the path towards this kind of future where, we aim to kind of turn cancer into a chronic disease rather than a terminal one.
I mean, I really like that because so much of cancer, results are, as you said, based on progression-free survival or survival, but no one takes into account um, the quality of the life. Right? You may be
Yeah,
alive, and your
yeah.
stuff may be shrinking, but you can't leave the house. You have no appetite, and as caregivers, it's very very hard to see some of those. So, I mean, for pancreatic cancer, if you can achieve that, wow, that would be revolutionary. That's one of the most aggressive cancers. I mean, if anyone gets pancreatic cancer, it's essentially a death sentence today.
And we aspire to change that. And you're absolutely right. The tolerability of most cancer treatments is just really devastating for quality of life. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Mhm.
We believe, it's just, it hasn't been a goal, right? I mean, I think there's been this real mentality throughout uh, all of oncology that sort of, it goes back to that maximum tolerated dose concept, right? As long as it's not poisoning a patient, as long as they can live with it, there's kind of this no gain, no pain, no gain philosophy, and we really believe that can and should change, but it requires kind of a slightly different set of goals and a slightly different way of evaluating
Mhm.
treatments, and so
Okay.
I think um, that's really where our deep cyclic inhibition approach shines, and I think that's where our drug candidates are really showing their ability to combine and enable patients to stay on them for long periods of time.
So one last question on this particular drug. What are you
Mm.
seeing in terms of the next like 12 months? Like, do you have a plan for when, phase three pivotal studies will be on? What's the next step?
Yeah, great question. So, we've already announced that we've started planning our pivotal study, our phase three. We aim to start next year,
Hmm.
and it obviously subject to ongoing data and regulatory authority feedback.
Hmm.
But we've got that planned out. It looks like a randomized controlled trial with this 104, our drug, plus the modified gemcitabine nab-paclitaxel, compared against standard of care chemotherapy. Um, and we're really in the first line setting, and just given the data that we've announced so far, we're really excited to evaluate that. And again, the goal, uh, right? Because it's interesting now in first line pancreatic cancer, really the standards of care, the patients essentially have to choose, do they, you know, or a decision gets made. There's FOLFIRINOX, which has longer survival but more toxicity,
Right.
and then there's the gemcitabine containing regimens, which are a little bit better tolerated and a little bit worse on response and survival. And so it's really kind of there's the option that lets patients live a little longer, and the option that lets patients feel a little better. And we just think that's kind of a terrible choice to have to make, or
Right.
really decision that gets often made by the oncologist just based on the performance status of the patient, how what they're able to tolerate. And so our goal would be to come in to that first line setting with an option that's both more efficacious and better tolerated, and just make that an easy decision, make it so patients can live longer and feel better. That's our goal.
Well, good luck to you on that. I can't let
Thank
you
you.
go without talking about what's happening in our world today. Uh, are the tariffs affecting your clinical trials, your supply chains, any of that? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, we're watching all that closely, but no major impacts to date.
No major impacts to date. Okay,
Yeah,
okay, that's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
And then final question: there's a lot of scrutiny on pharma pricing. This is a bipartisan issue. One one thing that I guess Democrats and Republicans can agree on. If you are successful in commercializing this product, how are you going to look at the pricing issue? Of course, everyone wants to have a premium on a drug that, if it does what it says, what you say it'll do, could really change the lives of patients. So, how are you going to look at pricing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's early to get into that. Let's start the phase three. Let's get into the phase three. And I think uh, it's an important topic, right? And there's certainly strong feelings all around. But I think ultimately, uh, the important thing is the value that you can create for patients, right? So if for us, our focus is really on developing a medicine that can just help cancer patients live longer and feel better in the process. And I think we sort of believe in the George Merck philosophy, right? If you serve the patients, the profits will follow. And for us, it's really about creating great new options for patients with some really tough types of cancer. And we think the data we've shared for 104 and pancreatic cancer really shows unique attributes in that area.
Well, perfect. Well, Ben, thank you so much for spending the time with us today at MedCity Pivot.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.